All right, hi you guys, everybody's signing in. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to get into the webinar and stuff and go over some housekeeping things before we jump in. Thank you to everybody who registered and who's in attendance today, and then thank you to our panelists for their time and lending their expertise to this discussion. For everybody coming in attendance, you are muted and you're off camera. That will be for the entire webinar. If you have comments or feedback or questions, things you want us to talk about in the Q&A at the end of the webinar, please use the chat box, which pops up on, I think, the right-hand side of your screen in the control panel to send in questions for our panelists. Okay, so I hope you guys are in the right place. The webinar today is over effectively including the voices of those with lived experience. And before we jump in, like I said, a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar, so everybody who's registered, if you have to jump off or you come in and out, you're gonna get a recording. You're also gonna get a link to the slides and the presentation today, and you're gonna get any resources that we share. So if we share like web pages or documents and stuff in our discussion, you'll get links to all of that. Like I said, use the chat box that pops up on the right-hand side of your screen in your control panel to send in questions and comments and concerns. We're going to save a window at the very end to have a Q&A discussion with panelists and audience. And so for those of you who are not familiar, NCHV is hosting this webinar thanks to the generous support of the Home Depot Foundation. This is our second go at a quarterly webinar series, and at NCHV, it's our role to share best practices and kind of connect service providers, consumers, those experiencing homelessness, housing instability to resources, and then, you know, kind of make things ease the flow of information. So the series is a second go at our quarterly webinars and kind of builds off of last year. David, you can take us to the next slide. So this 2022 series is going to be over equity. So this is our first webinar of 4. The theme throughout all of them, like I said, equity. This is kind of grown out of discussion and feedback we've had from conference, from service providers, and then you guys as we talked through our 4 topics last year. So what we do know is that great progress has been made to reduce and address veteran homelessness nationwide and as a full population over the last 10 years. We've seen about a 50% reduction. But what we also know is that this does not apply equally across the entire population of veterans experiencing homelessness or housing instability. We know as a whole of those experiencing homelessness, veterans are overrepresented in that population. We know that housing and homelessness and housing instability disproportionately impacts different genders, races, demographic groups. We know that housing or homelessness and housing instability looks different across different geographies. So we know the solutions have to look different depending on the geographies that we're talking about. And we know as a network, we need to do a better job at applying equity across our housing programs and our development practices if we want to really bring an end to homelessness nationwide. So throughout this series, we're going to be talking a lot about specific demographic groups, and we're going to bring speakers on that have expertise in their respective areas, whatever populations they're talking about. Some of the stuff may seem very population specific, and it is supposed to be. So this series is an opportunity for us to get into more of those like fine details that apply to specific populations, and then also to kind of draw connections where they exist between groups and issues. So yeah, if something does seem very specific to a population, it's meant to be. So I hope you guys keep your ears open and try to relate it to the work you do and the people that you do serve. And obviously we know if we are going to truly end veteran homelessness, we need to be open to and realize that different people have different needs and be able to adapt to meet the needs of all people. You can take us to the next slide, David. And so today, the topic for today, using the voices of those with lived expertise. And what we mean is specifically to influence housing design, community development, housing program administration, and on-site services. A lot of times when we talk about using the stories of those with lived experience, it seems very specific to program access and accessing supportive services. But today's webinar is a little bit different take on that. It's using people's lived experience to influence the way that we build housing, the way that we develop communities, the services we provide on site in that housing to make sure communities are, built specific to the populations they serve, and that community development as a whole serves the people who live in that community best. So we're going to talk about how to create opportunities for existing residents in affordable housing properties and how to involve future residents. We're going to talk about what we've learned from properties that are in operation, and then basically how we can make housing better property to property as we continue to build more affordable housing. And so we have really, really awesome panelists for you guys today. I think you'll be very excited. Okay, so our first panelist, Ron, he's going to talk about community development as a whole. He's going to talk about building inclusive communities using the experiences of the people who live in communities to make development decisions. So kind of a larger picture of that. And then we're going to move on to Leon. He's going to touch kind of on the evolution of permanent supportive housing. He's going to talk about the properties they built in California and kind of from our first property, what we learned and like what their most recent property looks like. And then we're going to finish up with Mike, and he's going to talk a little bit specific about Native American needs and those properties that we build to serve chronically homeless populations and those experiencing homelessness in that regard. So I'm going to go off camera. I'm going to let all of our panelists introduce themselves in their own sections. Thank you guys again. And then, like I said, if you have questions or comments throughout the webinar, please send in using your chat box, and I'll see you guys back at the Q&A at the very end.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Ron Hance. I'm the founder and executive director of the Network for Developing Conscious Communities. And so I'm going to take you through a discussion around equity and how equity plays into housing development as well as community development. Next slide, please. So when we talk about equitable community development, what is equitable community development? Well, we feel that it's a principle-based structural practice that intentionally includes a defined, agreed understanding of ownership, wealth building, and prosperity, which is inclusive and participatory that elevates Black Indigenous communities to the highest potentiality of conscious demonstration. What is equitable community development ecosystem framework? Well, this framework guides how the city-state prioritizes its work, shapes its budget, policies, programs, and investment, and structures the implementation of targeted community development ecosystem strategies and equitable development. Next slide. So, what fuels equitable community development? Well, it's the work of community development must be fueled by conviction. Stand up, speak up. It's important to educate on not knowing how to be, but how to accomplish. Reinvent community development by changing mindset, culture, and philosophy. There is a notion that all development is equitable. Well, there's inequitable community development. And that is community development ecosystem policies and practices that structurally advantage the privileged and structurally disadvantaged organizations and communities of lesser means. Equitable community development generates a culture of inclusion that recognizes the impact of the racial wealth gap, confronts racism, and fosters diversity and inclusion in the planning and implementation process. Most importantly, it recognizes that consciousness in community development doesn't just happen. It requires intentionality among participants, from those whose voices require hearing what the outcomes of development should be. Understanding that consciousness lays out a framework of principles that developers, government, and private sector businesses agree to. The community development equity ecosystem drivers. Well, first of all, is the advanced economic investment and opportunity, promotes community-led economic investment and opportunity for marginalized Black communities and enhance Black community cultural anchors, provides access to quality education, training, and living wage career and pathways. Secondly, it prevents residential, commercial, cultural displacement. Enacts policies and programs that allow marginalized Black populations, businesses, and community organizations to stay in their neighborhoods. The third driver, it builds on local cultural assets, respects local community character, cultural identity, and values. It preserves and strengthens cultural communities and builds the capacity of Black leadership, organizations, and coalitions to have greater self-determination and ownership. The next driver is it promotes transportation, mobility, and connectivity, prioritizes investment in effective and affordable transportation that supports transit-dependent communities. And lastly, it develops healthy and safe neighborhoods, creates neighborhood partnerships that enhance community health through access to public amenities, healthy, affordable, and culturally relevant businesses, and safe environments. Now, what is conscious community development? Well, we've come up with this definition of conscious community development, which is dependent on each generation relearning and committing to the awareness of consciousness within its culture. Generations develop consciousness as a main ecosystem centered on how we think, perceive, and visualize ourselves and communities. The 7 steps towards conscious community development. When promoting redevelopment in communities of color and on behalf of communities of color, work openly and fairly with those communities to do action plans for increasing collective asset wealth and equity ownership. Number 2, develop a defined partnership agreement that specifically outlines the equity, participation, roles, and responsibilities of community stakeholders in designated community projects or programs. Thirdly, go forward. Thirdly, thirdly, go back to the next one. Thank you. Thirdly, it determines at conceptual stage of project or program an implementation strategy for workforce development, training, and hiring of local businesses of color and community residents. Next slide, please. Fourth, it prohibits localized concentration of multifamily and single-family rental housing units in underinvested neighborhoods. And by that means that you don't want to concentrate the low-income housing in all underinvested neighborhoods. That you want to spread out the distribution of housing in neighborhoods. Fifthly, establish an income diversity plan for multifamily and single-family rental projects to eliminate high concentration of low-income housing units. And what we find in that is that particularly in the space of low-income housing tax credit housing, is that it's concentrated primarily in underserved low-income neighborhoods. And so you want to be able to create income diversity, educational diversity, cultural diversity. And you do this by distributing housing that meets the needs of everyone. Number 6, multifamily or single-family rental housing should be considered a secondary housing option in underinvested neighborhoods where home ownership rate is less than 40%. On the average, home ownership rate is 64% nationally. And that should be our goal towards creating a diverse community, is to increase home ownership to at least the national level of 64%. And so when you have housing that's taking place, particularly multi-family and single family in neighborhoods where the home ownership rate is less than 40%, it's disingenuous to that community. Seventh, develop mindful and intentional practice to ensure feasibility of transfers of asset ownership over time to local community ownership. We believe that particularly in multifamily housing, and particularly regarding low-income housing tax credit deals, that there should be a way to transfer those properties into local community ownership so that the community can maintain and see the growth of that housing over time. Next. All right. So what have I just covered? Well, I just shared with you some principal work around creating equitable communities. That in order to create equitable community, there must be a conscious effort to look at redistributing the wealth and prosperity of housing, and to ensure that there's a framework to drive equitable housing development in neighborhoods, so that you don't have high concentration of poverty or impoverished situations that can impede the growth of communities. So thank you. I think at this point I'll ask for questions, or should I all right, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Leon Winston, talking to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Retired in July of 2020 after 25 years of working at Swords to Plowshares in San Francisco, where I came there actually about 28 years ago as a homeless client and started working there in 1995. I retired as the COO and housing director. And I wanted to talk to you today about designing equity into the development of permanent supportive housing for veterans and families, and also for low income, for deeply affordable housing in general. I think it works for the broader population as well. In order to illustrate the topic in a manner that shows the incorporation of the needs of those with lived experience of being homelessness, having experienced trauma, and being at risk, I'd like to provide examples of 4 permanent supportive housing projects serving veterans and families exiting homelessness, and in one case, of families at risk of homelessness. These projects were developed over a period of about 25 years in San Francisco during my tenure at Swords. But before I go any further, there's a quote here I'd like to read. This is from an article entitled Equity in Design and Construction. It's by Paula Melton and was published in Building Green. Here it goes. Inequity is woven into the fabric of our built environment. Cities are endemically and segregated by income and race. Many building projects seek to enhance profits for developers, often at the expense of the surrounding community. The building professions lack diversity, leading to the unconscious but systemic exclusion of underrepresented groups like racial minorities and people with disabilities. So I think this follows on Ron's excellent presentation pretty well. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with the Veterans Academy. It's soon to be rededicated as the John Paulson Veterans Community. So the first project provides a sort of a meaningful context into what becomes a developmental story throughout my presentation of housing development becoming increasingly tenant-centered over time. And I think that's what we're talking about, being tenant-centered, as well as the other values that Ron spelled out so well. So it's kind of an interesting story, at least it is to me. I think probably a lot of folks on the call, being NCHV members, et cetera, very familiar with the transitional housing model. The initial pre-development work on this facility was underway shortly after I became employed at Swords in 1995. It's an adaptive reuse of former nurses' barracks on the Presidio of San Francisco, which was an Army base, is now a national park. It was envisioned at the time to be a transitional housing program tied to a very strong educational component with on-site computer learning, community college classes, and other classroom activities. Hence the name, the Academy. The agency at the time did not fully understand that the nature of operating subsidies that were being used to create this this opportunity were actually 100 HUD Section 8 vouchers, project-based vouchers, part of the Section 8 SRO mod rehab program. And services funding was coming through HUD supportive housing program, permanent housing for the disabled. So the confluence of those two issues meant this could not be a transitional program as it was envisioned. And so the agency, lo and behold, ended up with what turned out to be the first substantial veteran-specific permanent supportive housing site in the nation. And it's been operating in that way ever since. So it was a learning experience, a significant learning experience for the agency. Tenants had permanency, full tenant rights, could not be required to participate in any programming or to transition from the facility after any arbitrary time period, which are things that do happen in transitional settings. So as noble as the original intent was, what we ended up with was a permanent housing facility. And we had to learn, I'm speaking of Swords, had to learn as we went along. Eventually, a good bit of space that was designed for educational and treatment staff use, such as a computer lab, group room, multiple offices, were repurposed to better meet the needs of the permanent residents. The computer lab became a resident lounge. 8 offices no longer needed for staff became additional housing units. The community garden was added, and eventually we added elevators as well. Now, the setting of this facility is very important because the buildings themselves inside are rather institutional feeling. They're Army construction, cinder block construction. The units are fine, but it is an SRO model. Every 2 units, for those of you who've been in the military and know about BEQs, every 2 units shared a bath, which is not an unusual model in military housing on base. And there were community kitchens. Each unit could have a microwave and a fridge, but they couldn't really do any real cooking there, so they're community kitchens. We had a meal program on site that continued. But because of the surroundings, it's in a beautiful park-like setting. It's just walking distance to San Francisco Bay. Quality of life can be quite good there, even though the housing units aren't what we would want it to be. And I'd like to talk a bit about that for a second, just to acknowledge that when you're talking about ending homelessness, it's especially in places like San Francisco or LA or any big city, really, where you have a very large population of homeless, you really have to do what you can with what you have. So Swords operates a couple master lease hotels, which are SRO models. They certainly don't have the amenities that we would like to have for that they need for their become fully actualized, in my opinion. But when we can, which these projects show, especially going forward, is we can do better when we can develop them if we're intentional about it. Next slide, please. The next project didn't happen and didn't open until 2012, 12 years later. With the expansion of HUD-VASH in the Obama years, we began a partnership with the nonprofit housing developer, Chinatown Community Development Center. I'll call them CCDC from here on out. And we began looking for other projects. We started working on this project, Veterans Commons, in 2009. This is another adaptive reuse project, this time of a historic building constructed in 1918 that was initially a juvenile court and detention facility in San Francisco. The city and county made this surplus property available for the development of supportive housing, and our partnership was successful in winning the development rights to the project, converting it to 75 studio apartments with on-site support services. As you can see, it's quite a formidable building. The units are small, but each unit has its own kitchen and its own bath. Lessons from our first project played a role in how we designed the building. We knew that veterans were aging in place. We wanted them to be able to age in place. That's why we ended up getting elevators in that prior project. But we also know they had other mobility issues. So every one of these 75 units is fully adaptable, fully ADA adaptable. The building itself is fully ADA accessible. And all the bathrooms in each unit have walk-in or roll-in showers. So no one should ever have to move out for mobility reasons if they don't want to. They can spend the rest of their day, rest of their days there. So we want, as stated before, we want folks to enjoy the greatest autonomy and self-reliance and self-sufficiency as they can. In this building, because we were really identifying aging vets as the target population for this building, we also have there's a services suite on the first floor, which has a clinic room in it, so that visiting nurses and other medical staff have a place to meet with residents on site, and so help them stay housed and meet their needs. I should say, since Home Depot Foundation is supporting this webinar, that the Home Depot Foundation also made a sizable grant to this project. Next slide, please. This is the flagship, if you will, Edwin M. Lee Apartments. Ed Lee was mayor of San Francisco, who tragically died suddenly in office. He had a heart attack while shopping. And he was a big proponent. Prior to becoming mayor, he was very, very involved in housing rights. Pretty famous in San Francisco for that. And he signed on to the mayoral challenge, worked very hard and devoted a lot of energy to helping end veteran homelessness in San Francisco during his tenure, and brought other mayors from around the Bay Area into that effort. And so we ended up naming this after him. And it started construction while he was still alive and in office. And this was the first combined veteran and non-veteran family project we had. As you can see, it's there's 62 units for formerly homeless vets, 1-bedroom apartments and studios, and then 57 affordable family units for very low-income families, and a combination of 1, 2, and 3-bedroom units. So the design consideration for this building needed to reflect the needs of both of those populations. And that was a bit of a challenge for us to try and figure that out. And our development partner, once again, CCDC, does a lot of affordable housing for families. So even though they're our co-partner, we do the property management, but they also have a tenant services coordinator on site to work with the families directly on a supportive basis. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of data on this slide, and this is courtesy of our architects. These will be available for folks. But what this building, this is sort of a cross section. So the building is actually comprised of 3 wings around this park-like central courtyard. The veterans wing, the view that you have right now, if you were looking out a window from one of the veterans units, you'd be looking onto the courtyard and across at the family wings. There's a small services suite on the first floor of that wing, and a separate laundry facility for vets. And the central courtyard is designed in such a way that the play areas, I'm pointing on my screen, but you can't see that. Down on the lower part of the courtyard, that's where is more active. There's a barbecue down there. It accesses a kid's room, the family laundry. There's a teen room down there in the building. And because of issues such as PTSD, we wanted the veterans wing to be as quiet as possible. So we purposely sort of separated the populations and the noise-making aspects of it. The central part of the courtyard is more park-like. There's opportunities to sit quietly and enjoy the trees. And then the upper courtyard is for community gardens for all populations. Using my spot here. Okay. So there are a lot of, a lot of design considerations here. It's designed for equitable communities. It's designed for economy, wellness, energy, and also designed for recovery, as well as environmental factors, ecology. And very proud of it. It has been open for about a year now and doing quite well. Next slide, please. This is the final project that I worked on during my tenure at Swords. Maseo May was Swords to Plowshare's first housing director. He was responsible for the project on the Presidio happening, and he was responsible for us having housing opportunities on Treasure Island, where this is located. It's a former naval station in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Since 2000, Swords had operated first for most of those years transitional housing, and then permanent supportive housing and former Navy housing on the base, which was intended to be torn down eventually, and it will be after this and other buildings are completed. Spot here for a second. Some of you may have seen a presentation on this development by my former colleague Steve Culbertson last year. It's a modular design. This is the first affordable building going up in the redevelopment of the entire Treasure Island former base, the San Francisco's newest neighborhood, as they call it. It had more design constraints than did Edley Apartments, because it didn't have as much funding as that sort of showcase did. That's located right on the waterfront in San Francisco, and the lot is smaller, but we still had the same kind of design considerations going in here. So it's 105 units, permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless veterans and families. Those who are living currently in the Navy housing have the right to move into this building once it opens, February next year. And then there are additional units targeting veterans and veteran families exiting homelessness. Next slide, please. Here's another cross section from the architects. It's a little difficult to see, but you can see it later. Like at the apartments, this is what's known as a podium building, built around a central courtyard. The courtyard has an area with play structures and barbecue seating for gatherings, because there will be children in this project as well. But also, and you can see in the middle there's a grove of birch trees with pathways and small benches to provide some solitude and healing for the residents. And that's more, it's for everybody, of course, but it was developed more in keeping with veterans who experience trauma, to have a quiet place and be out in nature. It's in the middle of San Francisco Bay with great views. There'll be a park across the street, playground for kids. And once again, there's a large community room with a kitchen, and the apartments are the formerly homeless apartments are fully furnished, as they are in every one of our buildings, and also in each of the buildings, because food security is a huge issue. We've been successful in serving one meal a day as part of a senior and disabled younger adult program. It's funded through the city. I think it's federal subvention, so that folks have access to one healthy meal a day. And of course, we work with them to have food security and to be able to prepare their own meals. as needed on a case-by-case basis as well. What you see in these 4 buildings is a move away from SRO units to housing where couples and small families can live. One thing that always bothered me about running SROs is somebody has a partner, they can't stay with them, or they can only stay with them so many nights per month, because as the property manager, they can't have tenants' rights in a SRO building. A single room occupancy, that means something. So in these other buildings where there's studios and one bedroom and larger, couples can cohabitate. People have greater autonomy, greater sense of self. We know that limitations are necessary, and that there are challenges from a property management standpoint for different populations and that sort of thing. So when you talk about formerly homeless, a lot of folks want to put a lot of restrictions on folks, and there's understandable reasons for that. But I'm of the opinion that people deserve autonomy. They deserve the opportunity to thrive, and they shouldn't have to move right away to do that. So that's about it for me. Although I'm now retired, my contact information is here, and if anyone has any follow-up, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to be with you today. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Traylor, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Native American Connections. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss how Native American Connections incorporates lived experiences into our housing and services. Our mission is improving the lives of Native American people through culturally appropriate behavioral health, affordable housing, and community development services. And while Native American people are the priority population we serve, about 50% of those that we serve are non-native. Since 1972, Native American Connections has been changing lives, strengthening families, and building healthy communities. We began as a small grassroots organization operating one program for Native American men in recovery from substance use disorder. And today, Native American Connections owns and operates 21 sites throughout Central Phoenix, offering a continuum of affordable housing, health, and community development services, which touch and change the lives of over 10,000 individuals and families each year. Native American Connections furthers our agency commitment to the community with what we call CLASS, and that's culturally and linguistically appropriate services, and a cultural competency committee. The committee meets a minimum of twice annually to ensure that NACs is responsive and sensitive to the needs of special and underserved populations. The committee reviews staff demographic makeup against client demographic makeup to ensure that our staff closely mirrors the clientele that we serve. We also have a recovery and peer committee that includes former program participants to advise NAC leadership on identified community needs and gaps in services around recovery services and ending homelessness. NAC is a leader in the development of permanent supportive housing for people who have been chronically homeless. NAC currently has 6 permanent supportive housing communities in Phoenix. And in 2011, we developed Encanto Point. Next slide, please. Arizona's first housing first designed permanent supportive housing. We engaged a local architect who had significant experience designing rental homes for seniors and people with disabilities. We conducted design sessions called storyboarding with employees and prospective residents, both with lived experiences. We asked questions like, what do you want it to feel like? And participants responded with safe, not institutional, not closed in, open floor plans. And through these storyboarding sessions, we developed design standards for our permanent supportive housing communities. Now let's take a look at a couple of NAC's permanent supportive housing communities and see how these design standards were incorporated into the community. And I'm sorry, you probably can't read this very well, but in the lower left-hand corner in the yellow are the design features that came out of those storyboarding sessions. The first being a single point of entry, and that's a standard design feature for housing first communities. It helps us to keep the community safe, make sure that only the people that are residents want into the community come into the community. Another safety feature is the security cameras. It's an interior courtyard. We have lots of community gathering places because we want to encourage people to come out of their apartments and socialize within the community. We have a large donation room with a large freezer and refrigerator. We're very fortunate that we receive a fair amount of donations. It's important in the design of these communities that we have adequate space, not only for dry storage, but cold storage as well. There's a kitchen in the community room, because again, we want to encourage our residents to get together and socialize and have gatherings, and food is always an important element in those gatherings. There's a media center with a library, a fitness center. In Arizona, it gets pretty warm in the summer, and sometimes our residents tend to leave the doors and windows open, so we incorporated AC auto shut-off sensors on the windows and doors. We also have timers on the stoves and the rangers because sometimes we forget to turn them off. We have built-in shelving, hard surface flooring and counters, emergency pools in the bathroom if somebody has a health condition, overflow drains in the kitchen and the baths. We installed 1-inch drywall for long-term durability. And we have, in each one of our communities, we have a hot box to prevent bed bugs and interior bike storage. Our residents usually don't drive cars, so we made sure that there was adequate storage for their bikes within the units. Next slide, please. So this is the exterior elevation of Encanto Point. Interesting thing that I like to point out is that a lot of times as we develop these communities and build these beautiful buildings, we are replacing what was blight in the neighborhood. This was an old mobile home community, and as you can see now, the building blends in well with the neighborhood. We sometimes have some pushback from our neighbors when we come into communities, and through socializing with them and working with them, helping to understand what we're trying to accomplish and that there's really nothing to be afraid of. And then typically what happens is, like at Encanto Point, the neighborhood association, when they have their monthly meetings now, have their monthly meetings in our community room at Encanto Point. Next slide, please. So every unit comes furnished. Every new resident has a startup kit to get them started because most of our residents don't come with much. So we try to make sure that they're as comfortable and have all of the things that they need in order to take care of themselves. Next slide, please. So this is Dunlap Point. Again, you can see the design features on the lower left there, very similar to Encanto Point. The same single point of entry, security cameras, exterior courtyard, community gathering spaces. And out of Encanto Point, we learned that not only do we need interior bike storage, but because we do have so many bikes, we needed a community bike repair space. So we've incorporated that in all of our subsequent permanent supportive housing communities. The kitchen area and the community room, media center and library, the computer lab, fitness center, again, the AC shut-off sensors for the windows and doors, timers on the stoves and ranges, built-in shelving, hard surface flooring and counters, overflow drain in the kitchen and baths, hot box to prevent bed bugs, and interior bike storage. So Dunlap Point is a 54 unit permanent supportive housing community designed to serve the chronically homeless persons in a service-enriched environment. Situated on the edge of the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, this secured community is accessed through a single point of entry. Residents at their request will be wrapped with supportive services tailored to their specific needs, utilizing a housing first service model. And as part of a two-part campus, Dunlap Point is adjacent to Patina Mountain Preserve, which is a 55-bed congregate living community. And together, these developments create a safe and secure environment with rich and holistic supportive services using best practices from NAC's 45 plus years history serving the residents of Phoenix. Dunlap Point is a substantial partner in the state and city efforts to end homelessness, including veterans homelessness by offering permanent supportive housing solutions to honor the unique barriers encountered by these vulnerable populations. And on the far right in the blue, those are all the funding sources. So it takes sometimes 9 or 10 different funding sources layered in. I think Leon knows as well. Layered in order to develop this $12,700,000 development. Next slide, please. So this is the exterior of Dunlap Point. Next slide. And then again, you see all the units are furnished. The common areas have barbecues. Down in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the media room and the community gathering spaces, and then the single point of entry up in the top right. Next slide, please. So this is Patina Mountain Preserve, and I mentioned this because this is a pretty unique project. We've now built 2 communities like this with a combination of permanent supportive housing and our residential substance use treatment. They co-locate very well, and especially in this location. So as I mentioned, the Patina Mountain Wellness Center is a 55-bed residential substance use treatment for adult men, co-located with Dunlap Point, located on the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, and includes specialized services incorporating the environment and wilderness activities. Residential treatment provides substance use and co-occurring treatment services, focusing on the integration of mind, body, and spirit. Native American Connections clinical services are holistic, strengths-based, and culturally responsive. Native American traditional healing anchors evidence-based practices, creating a pathway to hope, wellness, and improved quality of life. During their stay, clients will participate in sweat lodges, smudging, talking circles, songs and drumming, red road teachings, native crafts and storytelling and cultural presentations, individual, family, and group education, life skills and health education, family reunification, parenting, healthy relationships, and domestic violence education, medical and medication services, and 12 steps and support meetings. Next slide, please. So this is the front exterior of Patina Mountain Center. You can see the mountain preserve in the back. Next slide, please. This, you can see our classroom on the right, and this is the talking circle, which has been very effective at helping people just talk about their issues and share ideas with each other. All of our permanent supportive housing and affordable housing communities are within walking distance to public transportation, including light rail and buses. They're all centrally located to ensure that our residents have easy access to employment, shopping, and services. We've formed strategic partnerships with other nonprofits. St. Joseph the Worker has a very effective employment training program. And they now have an office at one of our permanent supportive housing communities and have a presence in several others. They're assisting our residents with both job training and job attainment. Another partnership we formed was with First Place Arizona. It's an independent living opportunities for people on the autism spectrum. We received a grant from Sprouts Grocery to expand our community gardening program. And our residents from both our permanent supportive housing and First Place work together in the gardens on a weekly basis, producing and enjoying fresh produce. Strategic community partnerships are instrumental in NAC's mission to improve lives. Native American Connections incorporates lived experiences into all of our housing and services to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our customers. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, thanks. I'm sorry, this was, go back to that one slide, please. Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed that. This is, to the sweat lodge. The next slide, there you go. So this is the men in our community building a sweat lodge on the property at Patina Mountain Wellness Center. And now I'm finished.
I'm muted. All right, thank you guys all. That was great information. I'm working on pulling in questions. If I can get all of the panelists to come in, join me on camera and unmute themselves, we'll go through some of the feedback people sent in and questions people had. And anybody in attendance, if you have any thoughts or any additional questions, send them in. We're going to work our way through them here. All right, so one of the first questions that came in, and thank you guys for sharing actual project examples that people maybe can go and do some further research, and just a lot of questions came in too. You will get the slides, so a lot of the text and stuff that you want to look at a little bit closer, you can go in and look at. But for anybody who wants to jump in on this one, are there any resources which exist to help communities determine which models of affordable housing are best to invest in? With the new ARP funding, many investments will be made in affordable housing, and how do we ensure that we are spending those dollars wisely and equitably? So any resources you guys have in mind?
So, Jasmine, go ahead, Leon.
Oh, all right. I would, I don't have any in mind. As I said, I've been retired for a bit. No, you go ahead, Ron.
Sure. Well, let me understand the question, Jasmine. So they're asking, how do we determine in what type of housing to spend the dollars?
Yeah, like I guess how do we do a look at our community specifically and decide which type of housing we want to invest in? Like, where should we start with looking at that?
Well, I think in most of our communities today, it's pretty easy. It's more affordable housing in any size, shape, and color. We estimate that in Arizona, we need 270,000 affordable housing units just to catch up. So whether it's permanent supportive housing or affordable housing that serves folks that are 60% of area median income or less, there's just a real scarcity of it. And Phoenix is probably worse than most communities these days because of the significant appreciation. Home prices in Arizona increased 30% last year. Rental rates went up 30% last year. Seniors that are on fixed incomes that could afford their apartment yesterday can't today because the landlord's increasing their rent rates. So, we are the recipients of a fair amount of American Rescue Plan funds, and we're just working really hard with the governor and our administration here in Arizona to funnel as many of those dollars into affordable housing as we possibly can.
I would add too that that depending on your locality will depend on what you define as affordable housing, because affordability is based on income and availability. So I would think that to really answer this question, one has to look at what community they're looking at developing housing in, because every community is different in terms of its needs and the income levels that it's trying to meet.
All right. I think I know what you guys are getting at though too. It's like you have to sort of step back and do an inventory of like what you have in your community right now, where your needs are. And then I think that that's kind of where some of the points you guys brought up today of involving people that are actually going to be living in the properties or that are already living in the communities and some of that decision making. There was a comment that came in, which was like, if we are gonna have this open dialogue, then how do we create both like formal and informal opportunities for this type of sharing? So when we are considering the properties we're building, we're considering community development as a whole, how do we create the opportunities for people to chime in on what we're building?
I could answer that. So in preparation for building Maseo May properties, that last property that I presented on, we had the unusual opportunity in this case to know who a good portion of our tenants were going to be before we started construction. So we were able to have focus groups with as many of those folks who wanted to attend, and we would have pizza and that sort of thing to attract them, and then the architects would present the plans and get feedback from the prospective tenants on what they would like to see in their new building, because they were moving from this Navy housing into this new building, and there were some trade-offs on that. They all had their own garages before they're out. It wasn't going to be the case here. Things like that. They had laundry in their units in the Navy housing. They were going to have a group laundry here. So there was grist for the mill, if you will, in talking about that thing. But I think when they were presented with what we had in mind based upon years of experience and trying to improve sites for the population, much like Mike's presentations, adding these very specific aspects to the building, they were very happy. But it's kind of hard to do a focus group with people when you basically in San Francisco, people get into these buildings by lottery. So you don't know who's going to be offered the unit, and it's a little bit mean, I think, in some way to get people's hopes up. Say, oh, come to this meeting, tell us what you want in this building, but you're probably not going to move in. So it makes it a little tough that way. So you can do generalized focus groups, serve some food, ask people what, we're looking at doing some new buildings. What would you like to see? Where would you like to see it be? What amenities would you like? But to be more specific of that is dangerous, because you can't promise somebody they're going to move in.
Follow-up question that just came in, and I think we'll add it in here. Was it easier to build affordable housing on a former Navy base as opposed to in the community at large, just dealing with issues like NIMBY?
No. They have their own sets of issues. It has its own set of issues. But both of those former military bases were made available through Base Reuse and Closure Act back in the Clinton administration, and each base is different, and so I wouldn't say it's easier. Treasure Island, for example, it's brand new, so all the infrastructure had to come in, and both seismic work and things like that. I'd say it's not easier. It's just a different set of problems. Housing developers talk about brain damage, and every one of these projects, they're 5 or 6 years from concept to lease up, and there's a lot of work that happens before you put a shovel in the ground, and each one is complicated in its own way.
Okay. And I think this question came in during your presentation, Mike, but I'm pretty sure all of you guys will have something to add. But you all spoke about the properties and community development as a whole, everything being well connected. Mike, in your presentation, you touched on transportation access. And outside of the obvious transportation access, how do we make sure that affordable housing communities, especially for those that are exiting homelessness, do feel well connected to the community around them?
Well, our strategy at Native American Connections, as I mentioned, is to build permanent supportive housing in great neighborhoods. You know, we do have our job cut out for us at times, turning NIMBYs into YIMBYs, but we think that it's very important to not isolate people in an area that is void of services and public transportation. And so most of our communities in Phoenix are right on the light rail, within walking distance to the light rail. And if light rail isn't available, then they're within walking distance to a bus stop.
Another thing, especially if you're using tax credits, other sorts of public funding, your applications are going to be scored based upon your proximity to neighborhood amenities, grocery stores, transportation, pharmacy, things that make life, a walkable life from your home feasible. So that's one way to do it. As I mentioned, we have and it's nice to bring the community in as well. So these meal programs, lunch programs generally that we have at all these sites, they're open to the general public to come in, and if they meet the qualifications. So you end up with a sort of a sense of community there as well. You also want to be good neighbors. There's a lot of NIMBYism, so it really behooves the operator to foster these dialogues with the larger community before you start building, and you know, while you're in operation. That the Ed Lee apartments, part of the deal that we got from the city on that was that this community room, which is quite large and beautiful, had to be open to the general public by reservation, so people could have parties or weddings or whatever there to make it more part of the community. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis, but there are very many different aspects to community involvement, and so it depends on the nature of your residents and what they're comfortable with, and the community you're in, and the philosophy of the organization that's operating it.
Right. I feel like a good transition here. A couple of questions came in about financing and funding affordable housing. So you mentioned tax credit applications just now, Leon, and then in all of your presentations, you mentioned like financing these types of developments. So for the people who might have really good ideas and feel well connected to the community, but haven't actually done properties like this before, they run into a lot of issues applying for financing because they don't have that track record of experience. So do you guys have any tips or thoughts for those types of developers?
Just quickly, but as I mentioned, what Swords to Plowshares decided to do was to partner with a nonprofit housing developer that we got along well with. And some of the properties, the veteran and family property, that partnership is going to go on in perpetuity. Others are supposed to be turnkey eventually, because CCDC has a big portfolio of affordable housing going back decades, and we're pretty new to that game. Having a development partner like that allowed us to be successful in tax credit and other state funding applications where we're pretty weak on our own. And the idea is to build up that both the expertise and the track record over time, so the organization can then start doing its own development. The Veterans Academy, the first one, was a much smaller mod rehab project. There wasn't a great deal of financing required in comparison to new construction or even that historic rehab that I showed. But yeah, I don't think we would have been able to be maybe successful had we not had that partnership and that expertise, and it worked well for both parties.
Yeah, I agree with Leon. First of all, if you're trying to finance the project with low-income housing tax credits, there's usually a scoring category on experience, and you get a little bit more points for the amount of experience that you've had. So if you don't have any experience, you're not going to get any low-income housing tax credits. I always advise anybody that's going to get into the affordable housing business, don't do the first one by yourself. Get a good partner, like Leon said. We had a program here a couple of years ago with Corporations of Supportive Housing that we did in partnership with the Arizona Department of Housing, where our nonprofit affordable housing developers partnered with some other nonprofit service providers that wanted to get into affordable housing but hadn't had any experience. And so we were able to develop those partnerships, and a couple of us were able to get funding through the Department of Housing to build those initial projects for those nonprofits, and now they've got some experience under their belt and they can go on and develop affordable housing on their own.
Great stuff. I have a follow-up question, and also I'm going to use this opportunity to plug our podcast. We had some feedback come in. So if this stuff sounds really foreign to you and you're hearing like tax credits, what are tax credits, or man, we want to build affordable housing, but we don't even know where to start. We actually have a podcast that has project examples and goes through financing, building the partnerships that they're talking about, creating the relationship with veteran service providers or your COC, creating partnerships with your housing authority, things like that. So if you are completely like, I need a refresher on all this, or I've never heard of any of this, that might be a good place to start to learn how to build those partnerships. But this follow-up question that came in, finding housing subsidy can be the hardest part of developing affordable housing. Are there any partners that you guys have found other than the housing authority to provide housing subsidy?
Well, I mean, I can read you the list of funding partners that we had at Dunlap Point. In addition to the low-income housing tax credits, we had some funding from LISC, some from Home Depot Foundation, Wells Fargo Foundation, PetSmart Foundation, the Federal Home Loan Bank, and the Raza Development Fund. So those are all of our different funding partners in order to develop Dunlap Point.
Yeah, but as far as operating subsidies for extremely low income, you are going to need a subsidy, whether it's a Section 8 voucher or not. That's why the expansion of HUD-VASH allowed us to really leverage those properties. In Supportive Housing Development 101, it's a three-legged stool. You need operating subsidies, you need capital to build it, and you need services dollars. And in most places, it comes through the housing. It's HUD dollars coming through the housing authority, and there are different gatekeepers for HUD-VASH. The VA's involved, so they had to approve these project-based vouchers. We did a lot of work getting them to do that. They didn't want to do it for a long time until they saw the efficacy of them. But yeah, you do need to have a good relationship with your housing authority, and it doesn't hurt to have some political friends as well.
I will add too, we get a lot of calls from people who are interested in developing affordable housing, who are very new to this whole industry or anything like this, and it is all competitive. Probably not going to walk right out and win your applications for funding right off the bat, but if you get to a point of developing housing, you can make it a point to lease to people who have tenant-based vouchers. So where your property might not be competitive for project-based vouchers right now, if the rents are so to where somebody with a tenant-based voucher could afford to live there, doing work in your community with your partners and getting out there and finding those kind of renters is a place to start. That doesn't necessarily involve the housing authority right off the bat. You can go out and find those renters. They already have subsidies in hand. Let's see. So yeah, there seems to be differing opinions on this. Some people feel like those exiting homelessness, they need to be in housing that is just with people like them and, you know, with services that are specifically designed for them. And then there's this whole other half of people that feel like we need properties with mixed units. We need to, you know, spread all different types of people throughout the community and all different types of properties. So what are each of you guys' takes on that?
I'll stick my nose in again. So I agree conceptually that it's better not to have people all in one place. If you get, for example, in San Francisco, I would love it if up to 15% of these new affordable housing buildings were supportive. But if we did that, there's not enough housing production, period, to ever put a dent in the population. So the only way that we were able to do so, to actually make a lot of headway on ending veteran homelessness, ending chronic homelessness, is to create these intentional communities, because there simply isn't enough affordable housing being built by having just inclusionary units within those projects and to really put a dent in it. So yeah, I think it's a great thing to strive for, and in some communities that may work very well, but in others the problem is just too big. You'll never make any headway that way. So I applaud the 10-15% supportive, right? But also some individuals do better, and I don't think this is veteran specific, but it may be, and then maybe maybe the Native American population as well do better in communities of people with shared experience. So I think you have to look at both sides of that.
I think the other challenge too, Leon, is that you know, when you're doing per supportive housing as 10 to 15% of an affordable housing development, I don't know that you have the opportunity to provide some of the robust services that some of our residents need.
Yeah, all right. I did see some conversation recently too about the idea of transitioning people from permanent supportive housing units to other affordable housing units. So like a pathway out of supportive housing into affordable housing without the supportive services. So I definitely think something like that is worthwhile looking into. I don't know if scattered site may be better if that plan's in place. Let's see. So do you guys know of any other military facilities? I think you actually answered this already, Leon, that have become transitional housing. And maybe name drop them so they can go and do some research.
I think on the former Army base Fort Ord in Monterey, there's transitional housing. I don't. I know there are other places around the country. On Walter Reed campus, I think there's permanent supportive housing going on with Help USA. So there are through the Base Reuse and Closure Act, localities where these bases were located that were being closed had an opportunity to have a homeless component in the redevelopment of those bases. And I'm only aware of some of the veteran ones. Beyond that, I'm sure there are others, but those are only two that come to mind right now.
All right, I'm gonna do this question and I probably won't end on this one just because it feels like a Debbie Downer. So somebody send in another one to follow up this question. But what do you do when you reach a point when you have this housing that's financed and it's built maybe, and you reach a point where you're like, okay, this is not gonna serve the population well, or there are a lot of issues, or this location doesn't really work well for the people we're trying to serve, but you've already built it. So you're having people come shop it, maybe do visits, and they're just like, this is not interesting to me. This is not a place I see myself living. I guess to what degree can you modify the property that's already there to be appealing to people? Or what do you do at that point when it's not the best fit for the people that you intend to serve?
Try to avoid that situation.
I guess redevelop. We've never had that problem because I think we've learned to do our homework.
Involve the community first. Yes. All right. Okay. Let me find some. I have a lot of good feedback. People seem very appreciative of the information we're sharing and the dialogue. Let's see. Okay, we have a question that just came in. I am working to serve a large region, but the VA offices across the counties rarely talk to each other. Any advice to overcome the current stovepipes to reaching homeless veterans?
Well, just between us, one of our biggest challenges is the Veterans Administration case management, and in most cases, it's non-existent. So we're struggling with that.
You've seen one VA, you've seen one VA, as they say. So I don't think there's any broad brush stuff. Get to know the homeless coordinator at your local VA or your local CBOC, and it's to help them do their mission, right? It's a partnership to help your mutual mission of ending homelessness for veterans, if that's the population you're serving, and just come from that place, and hopefully you'll be successful.
Good stuff. Yeah, their follow-up was, I'm just making sure it's not just me. So no, not just you. And yes, we have an upbeat kind of question to wrap us up on. So I hope everybody has something to chime in on this. So for all of the speakers, will you guys share one surprising thing you learned from potential residents during your pre-planning process, which changed or shaped the way that you approach the development, the amenities, things like that? So something potential residents shared.
I've got only one, a quick one. It's kind of funny on top. So for Veterans Commons, that historic building that you saw, that's almost entirely HUD-dash. VA brought perspective. We had focus groups with people who were being offered housing there. So was talking to them, and we told them, this is, the PET policy. It's a non-smoking building. I expected a lot of pushback, having worked with vets for a long time and being a former smoker myself, on the tobacco issue. Nobody cared about the tobacco. They wanted to know about marijuana smoking. And so we had to talk, well, learn to bake, do this sort of thing. So that's my only one off on that. So I'll shut up now.
Well, as I mentioned when we were doing our storyboarding, a big issue was the open floor plans, including no doors on closets, no doors on bathrooms. Really wanted this sense of openness without doors in the interior of the apartments.
All right, good stuff. And like I said, a lot of positive feedback coming back. A couple of things I want to just let everybody know before I go ahead and close this out for today. Thank you again to our panelists for attending and everybody who's in attendance. There are 2 handouts you guys will see in your control panel. These are a little bit deeper dive on equity and issues related specifically to veteran homelessness and the disproportionate impact on certain groups of people. Like I said, this series, this entire year, is over equity. So this is the first of 4. The next 2 webinars will be on smaller subpopulations of veterans. And then our final webinar for this year will be over kind of like people-centered design, but also equity in location, equity in like the development, design, and all that kind of stuff for specific housing units in the community themselves. So whereas this one was incorporating people with lived experience into the design process, that one would be more like looking at the community as a whole. And so, yeah, we hope to see you guys back. If you will just leave feedback, in your comments as you're heading out today. Thank you guys again. Recordings will be in our follow-up email along with the slides. And if that's it, nothing else, I don't think we're out a little bit early today. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.